Absolutely. And we heard George W. Bush, the man who was president on 9/11, say today, 20 years ago, we all found one way or the other that our lives would be changed forever. But part of the way that our lives changed was the way that American foreign policy changed. Something called the Bush Doctrine came about. He defined this in his memoirs in this way, saying we make no distinction between terrorists and the nations that harbour them. We hold both to account. He also talked about advancing liberty and hope as an alternative to the enemy's ideology of repression and fear, the democratisation agenda. And in that way, what happened in 9/11, the ripples spread out to the rest of the world, nowhere more perhaps than to the Middle East. And I'm joined now by Dr. Maha Yahya, who is from the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Thank you for being with us. I know you've been listening to the end of the ceremony we've been hearing in New York. I wonder what you think is most important for our viewers to know about the way in which 9/11 affected your region, the Arab world.
Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Philippa, for having me with you. First, I just want to kind of pay my respects to those that lost their lives in 9/11. I think we all remember that terrible moment, or moment that led to such tragedy. However, the ripple effects of 9/11 and what followed are still with us, particularly in this region, more than ever before. 9/11 was the pretext, opened the door to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, with the intention of removing Saddam Hussein from power, President Saddam Hussein from power. The problem is that with the invasion of Iraq, the country was literally pulled apart in the first 6 months after the arrival of US forces there. If you recall, under Paul Bremer, there was a move to de-Ba'athify. The army was literally liquidated overnight. They were told to go home. So there was a real attempt. The idea was you kind of collapse all institutions and then you rebuild again. Bottom line is there was no rebuilding. The country was pulled apart, but there was no systematic rebuilding in a way that, and we're seeing the results today in Iraq, which also opened the door for Iran to extend its influence in Iraq in ways that had not been possible before. In a region where Sunni-Shia polarization had been contained primarily to the Iran-Iraq war, which took place over 8 years, it also opened the door to much more polarization broadly across the region. This is on the negative side. Iran's influence prior to 2003 in the region was political, and its actual presence was mainly in Lebanon through Hezbollah. Today, we see where Iran's influence there. And it's ironic because obviously the Bush Doctrine was about containing Iran as well, at least so they said at the time. On the positive, or perhaps the brighter side, is it also pushed governments in the region, the democratization doctrine, as you called it, pushed some governments in the region to kind of pay lip service to democratic governance. And we saw an attempt at creating some modicum of representation in a number of countries, whether through the creation of municipal elections, establishing municipal elections for the first time, in countries like Oman, like Saudi Arabia, that yes. Legislative entities, etc. But I think also, just my last point is that with the image, the power, the image of the statue of Saddam Hussein being pulled down by Iraqis stayed within this region, and we saw the ripple effects, I think, of that 10 years later in the Arab Spring. But there, people were not waiting for someone from the outside to come and topple down governments. People just took the streets and toppled down not only statues, but also autocrats like Ben Ali in Tunisia, or at the time Mubarak in Egypt. So I would argue that in a sense, there is a journey there.
Can I pick up on your points to ask you about the intended effects and the unintended effects from Washington and NATO's reactions to 9/11? It could be argued that the determination to follow Afghanistan with Iraq sowed the seeds for the self-styled Islamic State group.
I'm not sure it sowed the seeds for that, because, I mean, Islamists struggled between 2003 and 2013, over that decade. They did struggle. I mean, they were quite disorganized. You had pockets of Islamist groups popping up in different places, but there was no concerted effect. I would argue more that the emergence of ISIS in 2013 was partly because, yes, absolutely, the exclusionary politics that followed in Iraq post 2003, the lack of nation building. For the first time, the sectarian representation became part of the Iraqi constitution in ways that it had never been before. Polarization between the Shias and the Sunnis, the exclusion of the Sunnis from the regime, from power, if you want, from political power, the sense that they had become the disenfranchised within the country. Corruption, bad governance. In the story, we all know the story. So all of this, yes, paved the way. In that sense, yes, 2003 did pave the way for the emergence of ISIS in 2013. But that project has failed. My concern is now we've come back a full circle with the withdrawal of the Americans from Afghanistan and the chaotic way they did it. The withdrawal also of America from the Middle East in many ways, that we may see a resurgence again and these kinds of extremist movements.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maha Yahya, for giving us your thoughts on this important day.
Thank you, Philippa.